Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Transgender Show. I'm your host, Emily. Tonight, I'm excited to welcome to the show Jess Rising of Instagram. Jessica is femme, trans, bi, ace, and most importantly, a Dungeons and Dragons nerd. By day, she is a computer program. By night, she runs D&D games predominantly for people in the trans experience. Everybody, welcome to the show, Jessica.
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Can't help but notice that you have an accent. It wasn't in your bio. Where are you located?
I am from the UK, more specifically the northeast of England, so I have a somewhat noticeable northern accent.
Somewhat noticeable, right?
Well, if you're not from the UK, then yeah, probably.
How do you identify and what are your pronouns?
Sure. First off, my name is Jessica. My pronouns are she, her. I identify as transgender femme, but also asexual, bisexual. Um, yeah, collecting all the labels at the moment, apparently.
You want all of the letters of the alphabet mafia, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm running out of space for my flags.
Some, yeah, that's great. Somebody already commented they love all the flags in the background. How did you choose your name?
Oh, that's a fun question. Yeah, it's a very sort of unique and privileged position to be in to kind of reinvent oneself in such a way, and it's a very daunting moment.
Hmm.
I really wanted to have a fairly run-of-the-mill name. I wanted something that could be shortened, so I could go by Jess as an affectation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I ended up with three names, of which Jess was one of them. And that was the one that just felt right. So I started telling people that's the name I wanted to pick, and both my mother and sister were quite shocked because prior to my birth, my parents had picked out both a masculine and feminine name for me, and it turns out, unwittingly, I'd gone back to the name that they'd selected for me, which just added this extra dimension to the name, which was completely unintentional. So it just had to be Jessica. Yeah, in fact, I'd actually intentionally not asked what name they had chosen because I wanted to choose something that felt more like I had agency over it, and
Mm-hmm.
it just turned out to be that name. So I gotta have it both ways, really.
When did you first realize that you were trans? When did you realize that that was the label that fit for you?
It was February of 2019, so just shy of 3 years ago. Is that right? Is that 3 years ago? Gosh, the last few years have just flown over. Kind of came a bit out of the blue. I think was a culmination of a series of events over the previous 6 months. But yeah, that was the first day that I thought to myself, yeah, I think the label of transgender is the experience that I'm having right now. I think that best describes how I feel about myself.
Mm-hmm. And then with hindsight being 2020, what was it that you kind of could look back to your youth and trace as those little breadcrumbs that would lead to you being trans?
When creating characters for video games or for role play or other things like that, I gravitated more to a feminine persona, and never really had a good answer or understanding as to why. And I think, when you're younger, it's very easy to be like, oh well, women are pretty. I will play a pretty woman because then I will get to look at said pretty woman a lot more often. But then, yeah, absolutely, with hindsight, it's oh no, no, my sweet, so much more to this than that.
Yeah, did you know
uh,
in your youth, did you get challenged on that a lot when you would choose female characters? Just different
no,
things.
that was more of a like an adolescent sort of just by myself playing video games kind of thing. I think socially, I sort of, being sort of assigned masculine at birth, just kind of conformed into that gender role almost like a default, not really giving it much thought. But I definitely feel like the year prior to my realization, the sort of idea of me as a masculine person and my understanding of my masculinity basically stopped having any meaning. And it's sort of my understanding of my own gender just kind of fizzled into nothing.
Hmm.
Um, and it was, yeah, it was a bit of an odd one. It wasn't something that was like concerning by any means to me or giving me great cause for thought. Um, but yeah, I just didn't have a very strong relation to masculinity.
What was it then that cracked your egg?
Okay, so yeah, probably about 6 months prior to the egg cracking moment, I started dabbling a bit in cross dressing, and it was very much a completely private, hidden from my housemate, hidden from my girlfriend, tell no one, do not get caught at any costs, box of things hidden deep under the bed. Um, and it was something that I kind of played around with when I was alone in the house, and didn't really understand why I was doing it. There was a lot of shame attached to it, as this is not a normal thing to be doing. Why are you doing this? But there's something here that is resonating with me, if for no other reason than because I'm just getting a bit of a kick out of it. Uh, but after like putting a wig on for the first time, there was a few times where I thought, okay, well maybe there's some thrill to be had here. There was actually like a few moments where I looked in the mirror and went, wow, I really look like my mother. This is remarkable. And I just really did not know how to process that.
Hmm.
So I think it all started fitting into place at that point, but it remained very much a subconscious thing. Got a bit overwhelming. My housemate and I parted ways, and I moved into my own place, which afforded me more to dress without having to worry about someone coming to the house and, oh my gosh, I've got a full face of makeup on. What am I supposed to do? Um, and the weight of all of that just started pressing down. Ultimately, I think the 3 months prior, my mental health started to decline, and I think the thing that worried me most about it, I couldn't figure out what the cause was. There wasn't one thing I could point to and go, okay, I'm not feeling great about this. Therefore, I know what I need to do to try and address this. I know, plan of action, steps forward, that sort of thing. So it was just a bit of a free fall with no cause or end in sight. And it ultimately culminated in the day in question. I was round a friend's house. We had a bit of a routine at the time where we would take turns hosting each other for dinner and a film. And it was his turn to host. I'd pick the film, and I think it was John Wick or John Wick 2, a film which I've seen a few times. And we were sat on his couch watching this film, and I was so not present in the situation, um, that I actually lost my place in the film. I was like, I genuinely don't know where we are anymore. I know this film inside out. And it was just this realization that I was just sat there stewing through my own thoughts, just my brain a complete frazzle. And I just didn't know what was going on anymore. So at the end of the night, I apologized for really not being a good friend, not being very talkative, not being very involved in the moment, and kind of having the evening that we'd set out to. And I left to go get public transport home, and there was a 20-minute walk. And on that 20-minute walk, I just mentally beat myself up. You've ruined this evening with your friend, and you've not been a good friend. What is going on? And so ultimately, the thing that got me to think about my situation wasn't, I don't feel well mentally. It was, I've hurt my friend. And at least I thought I had.
Hmm.
That was how I felt about it, and that was unacceptable because for some reason my own mental health wasn't important, but being a good friend was,
Hmm.
which is just kind of the place I was at. So I got home. I needed to put some fuel in my car for the following day, so I drove around to a local filling station, and on the drive over there, I basically the egg cracked. I'd been that evening sort of flirting with a few labels and trying to like put into a coherent thought uh, what I thought this feeling was, helpfully um, armed with some knowledge of LGBTQ labels and trying to find one that seemed to be the right fitting box for my experience. And I ended up turning the car around. I couldn't get out of the car and stand on a on a petrol forecourt, even though it was the dead of night and no one else was there. And ended up driving home sort of with the realization in mind. At one point, I considered pulling over to just have a bit of a moment, but pushed on because I thought, well, if I pull over into some, lay-by or little parking area on the side of the road, I'm just going to bawl my eyes out. I'm just going to cry, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to drive home.
Hmm.
So that was quite an intense evening, but it all kind of came into very sharp focus very quickly.
And then what was that next day like? What was it, what did it feel like for you once that all kind of settled and you realized, okay, it's my gender, that's what this is about, and I need to do something about this.
It was such a huge revelation that it did not take me long to tell people. Yeah, then the initial shock was swift, and then the realization that okay, I want to act upon these thoughts. I want to start transitioning. Where do I even start with that? I really don't know. I need to do my research. I need to, seek out other people's stories and see what of that resonates with me, what I might want to do, what I might not. But I didn't want to do that alone. I wanted to tell people. So within the first week, I had a few conversations with some of my close friends and my girlfriend, and that was probably the hardest conversation at the time because I kind of in my head I'd had to make peace prior to that conversation with the notion that I am going to ring her up and we might not be in a relationship by the end of that phone call. But if that's the consequence of this revelation for me, that is one I'm willing to accept. It didn't go that way. We are still happily in a relationship. She was uh, as surprised as I was, but accepting and willing to see what the immediate future held. Um, and then I think the following weekend, because we were long distance at the time, we were about 120 miles away, which in the
Wow.
UK is actually quite a big distance. I know the US distance kind of skews things, but
It does.
we were only seeing each other on the weekend, and we weren't actually due to be seeing each other that weekend. But she came back to spend time with me and to have some of these very personal, hard, and intimate conversations in person. So she was right there with me on my side from day one.
Wow, that's
Um,
amazing.
yeah, she's pan, so it wasn't actually much of an issue.
Wow.
She still loved me for the character and personality that I am, and when she realized that this was really giving me life and sort of breathing a lot of energy into who I am, then only strengthened our bond.
Was there more involved in coming to terms with your identity? Was what was that process for you in accepting yourself and moving forward with confidence?
I mean, first it just stemmed from just having a good understanding that the way that I felt was correctly labeled, and that the first part was just really understanding, yeah, is this exactly what my experience is? Is this the label I want to use? And I probably did actually take a day sort of flirting with a few different labels before realizing that transgender was definitely the one that resonated the most. Um, and then I definitely recall a very strong sense of, wow, my life has gone from being pretty pedestrian to one of an immense uphill battle almost overnight. And I think the realization that I was going to have to work super hard for a lot of people to kind of accept me,
Mm.
to feel valid myself within myself, um, and to just kind of get to a point where I could feel a bit more comfortable in my skin was huge. I think there was also an immediate realization that, like, a lot of my privilege had just evaporated as well. There was always going to be some aspects of my life that many people take for granted that I was now going to have to fight for.
Mhm.
And healthcare was definitely going to be one of them. So I think at the time, not really having the understanding of all of those implications, which I'm currently grappling with in real time, um, yeah, it still seemed like a lot. And there was a moment of like standing at the edge and thinking to myself, okay, I could walk away from this and I could go back to how it was, but that's going to bring more misery, and it's just going to be a form of denial, and it's not going to satisfy or achieve anything. I need to plunge myself into this, but I'm kind of willingly bringing all of the hurt and potential pain and hardship that comes with it. I have to choose to do that to myself. But I pushed myself into it because I really didn't see any alternative. Um, and then I think beyond that, once I realized that this is what I was going to do, I'm very much a big believer in a to-do list. I'm the sort of person who tries to figure out what are the individual things that I need to do, how do I achieve them, what order do I achieve them in.
Mhm.
So as soon as I was motivated to do it, it was like, okay, well, first step is telling people. Second step is probably, yeah, going to my doctors and seeing what my options are. Um, I know that the way that trans healthcare works in this country tends to be um, presenting before medication. So, what can I do about that? How do I approach that? Can I do that at work? Can I do that at home? And really just starting, just taking it one step at a time and seeing where my comfort levels were. And yeah, everything's just suddenly everything was super scary. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common. At that time, did you have a particular role model or confidant, somebody you could turn to for, that had experience with any of this?
Yes, I think I was quite fortunate to have friendship with two trans individuals, both trans femme. Um, one of which that I'd fallen out of touch with by that point, but I would say knowing her and her sharing her truth with me several years prior really gave me that context of what it is to be trans and what it is to be transitioning much further down the line than obviously where I was at square one, and seeing her absolutely thrive. And that gave me, first off, just the knowledge of what it was to be trans, but then also the knowledge that this is not like going to be a lost cause for me. You can absolutely be a successful, confident, happy person and be trans. Um,
Mhm.
but one of my longtime friends who I've known about 10 years, we met through video games, and that friendship kind of became less of an online thing. She is trans, um, and yeah, she was one of the people that I went to. I didn't want to put words in her mouth and just kind of gave her a description of how I felt. And then at the end of the conversation, she very sheepishly went, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I have a good feeling of I've got a good idea of what I think you're feeling, but I don't necessarily want to just say what that is. I want you to come to your own realization. And I think we were both trying to be protective of the exact same thing. And I just said, yeah, I think I'm trans. And she's like, yeah, that was the impression I got. So it filled me with a lot of confidence in myself that another sort of trans person that I knew very well and looked up to in that moment kind of confirmed it for me. Though obviously, how I feel about myself is all the confirmation I needed. Um, it was still a very validating moment, knowing that she would be there for me, and we spent many a night talking about the nature of my feelings and what I might do about it, and her experiences, which we hadn't really talked about in depth, were suddenly on the table.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, very very fortunate to know such people.
Yeah, that's amazing to have that person, and you kind of brush it aside, but I do feel it's really important, at least in those early stages, to have that external validation because it's all internal. You don't have a compass for this. Maybe you've kind of understood that I'm trans, but it still doesn't feel real in some ways. It's still something that you have to
Yeah,
explore and understand. It takes time. So having that early external validation really kind of sets you on that and gives you the confidence to go, okay, I can move past this now and figure out what's next. How did coming out in the other areas go, like at work and with your family?
initially, it was individual conversations. I cherry picked a few people that I thought would react well to the news, um, and who were important to me. I mentioned a close friend that I worked with, who we talked pretty much daily about anything really. So I had a text chat message to her, just kind of running through my thoughts. I think I may have spoken to her before I'd even really settled on the transgender label,
Hmm.
just to kind of sound out some ideas. But then it was a string of just catching people for 10, 15 minutes at the end of the day, or making a phone call. And within a week, things moved very quickly for me. I would say in my sort of the immediate aftermath of this, within a week, I'd spoken to 5 or 6 people
Yeah.
who it was really important that they knew. So next up was the family. Both of my parents are divorced, so that was 2 separate conversations. Both times I had my girlfriend there with me. Both times the conversation went really well. My mother and sister were present for the first. Um, they were again surprised. I think that's a pretty common theme here because I didn't see it coming. My family certainly didn't. Um, and yeah, they were very supportive. It was, we love you no matter what. You're still part of the family. You're still really precious to us. We will figure this out, and we're there for you. Just kind of keep us in the loop. And then literally the following day, I went and spoke to my dad and his wife. Um, my dad was a touch quiet. Uh, his wife, my stepmom, she did most of the talking, and she was sort of gushing with emotion and pride that I had been so brave to take such a step, and there was a lot of expressed love there. I asked my dad straight up why he was being so quiet, because it was a bit of an unknown, and he was just processing it in his own way. He
Hmm.
was very proud and supportive, but again, the shock of it just kind of made him go a bit quiet.
Yeah.
Um, I I came out at work probably 3 to 4 weeks after coming out to myself.
Mhm.
So it was a rapid roller coaster of a few weeks, but it was something I really wanted to get on with because I wanted to start presenting as an authentic version of myself pretty quickly and start understanding and experimenting with that at work, knowing that the people there would be very accepting. So I asked, because it was a small company of about 20 people. So I asked a few people in the management layer, 3 or 4 people, if we could have a meeting. Actually, initially I spoke to my manager, who then, on my behalf, set up a meeting. And I came prepared to that meeting with sort of things I wanted with regards to announcing that I was trans, and um, just things, things that I wanted to sort of express, like this is how I feel, this is how I want people to refer to me, these are my pronouns, all of that stuff. And I got a really positive response. The CEO was present, and he, in his personal life, knows a transgender woman. So he was super supportive, very sympathetic. And I asked him if he would, at the end of a fairly standard weekly all hands company meeting, if he would just say a little piece and then kind of pass over to me, and I could speak a bit more on how I felt and what I wanted from people. And that went over really well. There was a brief, excruciating moment of silence, and then a couple of my closer colleagues spoke up in support and said, it's super brave what you're doing. We'll absolutely accept you for who you are, and anything we can do to help, just let us know.
Wow.
So yeah, it went over pretty well. I only ever had like one incident at work where I didn't feel the acceptance as much, and that was just some absent-minded misuse of pronouns. When because I work for a web development agency, so there's a lot of dealing with external clients who we're doing work for, and I was moving onto a piece of work with a new client. So typical sort of setup meeting where it's like, okay, here's the client, here's the people who are going to be doing the work, say hi to each other. And my manager just kind of absent-mindedly used my now outdated pronouns, and I was literally going to pull him into a meeting and say that is not cool. Please don't ever do that again. But one of the other people in the room beat me to it and berated him quite heavily and told him he needed to pull me back into the meeting room and apologize profusely. So people had my back,
That's
and
amazing.
he has been a model ally ever since. I think he just needed that quick kick up the butt to realize that he needed to be actively working at it. But I've always been pretty, at least in the first 6 months, I've always been pretty chill about. Well, people have known me a certain way for so
Mhm.
long.
Yeah.
It is human to err. There are going to be times when you use the wrong name or pronoun because it just rolls off the tongue that way. Just apologize, do not dwell on it too long, and let's just move on because I don't want to dwell on it any longer than
Mhm.
you do.
So, was there anybody that supported you when you came out that surprised you, or supported you in a way that was like more than you expected?
I had a few people at work who I genuinely didn't know whether they would be accepting. I think the scary thing when there's 20 people who you really need all of them to be on side to feel comfortable
Mhm.
is it just takes one person to give you a bad experience to kind of poison the well. And I'd identified and vocalized to management when we were having conversations about this that I thought there would be a few people who I genuinely didn't know which way they'd go, and they were all absolutely wonderful and lovely. Usually the sort of people to make crude jokes, and I was worried that I would be the next crude joke.
Yeah.
But they were just, yeah, absolute model allies. Never had any problems with them. A couple of people who literally never even tripped up on my name or pronouns, which was just an absolute blessing.
So, with that great experience that you had in coming out, what was the toughest conversation you had?
Without a doubt, that was my grandparents. So that was my mother's parents. So in our family dynamic, my grandparents are very much parental figures. We used to go around for family dinner like once a week. That was just a very normal thing, and I would drive quite far back from work to make that happen. My hours were adjusted to make that happen, and it was always a big family event. Um, I knew it was going to be a tough conversation because my grandmother in particular was a very traditional person, And she was very much the sort who wore her heart on her sleeve. If she didn't get it or it wasn't something that she was comfortable with, she would tell you. So I knew it was going to be a hard and frank conversation. I went with my mother and girlfriend, and no, it was just with my mum. We sat in the car for a couple of minutes beforehand, and my mum like got quite teary because she knew it was going to be a hard conversation, and she knew my my grandmother was going to get emotional, and she was going to have to be there to help her through it. Um, Probably not my mother's finest moment, realizing that perhaps I also wasn't feeling great about the whole thing. Um, but yeah, we went in, and there's something Jess wants to talk to you about. So yeah, I came out. The immediate reaction from the pair of them was one of loss, and it was it was actually honestly unexpected to have such a strong negative reaction. It kind of felt like a death in the family had just been announced. Um, their stance was somewhere between I there is something wrong with me to um, yeah. So I think the one phrase that my grandmother said that will always stick with me was, and if you just give me a second, I'll try and quote this as accurately as possible. Um, I used to think that I had six perfect grandchildren, but one has fallen off the step. And that was her way of saying that what I was expressing to her was a failure. Not just my failure, but her failure as a grandmother. Um, and it was very interesting as the conversation developed because they saw this as a great sadness, and there were tears. Um, and they were asking questions like, what's your plan? The idea of like hormones and potential surgeries in my future was like very shocking to them and very visceral. Um, One of the questions my grandmother asked, which I actually found quite entertaining, was, what is this going to do for your career prospects? In her mind, the only answer that I could give to that question was, I'm gonna really struggle to get promoted or to get a new job in future. But I said, well, it is going to affect my career prospects, but quite frankly, I work in software development, and typically speaking, the most of the companies that I've interacted with are very pro LGBTQ, very pro diversity, and frankly, being trans is appealing to them. And I don't believe that it's going to hinder my career. It certainly hasn't. I've been promoted twice since then. Um, so I think their old world mindset suddenly crashed headfirst into I I'm going to struggle with this, but actually my life is not going to be held back in the ways that you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
So their worldview had to adjust very quickly. Um, I know following that meeting, my grandmother's two other children came to her separately, and one of them, my auntie, had a very stern conversation with her, saying, "You need to be better because Jess needs you to be, to be accepting."
Mm-hmm.
Um, and she, to my grandmother's credit, as much as I don't think she still really got it, um, right up to her final days, she still treated me like any of her other grandkids, and the
Wow.
love was always apparent. I think it just took her a moment to check her worldview and adjust.
Well, I think it's to be expected with somebody in the older generation. The further you go back, the harder it is. I mean, when I was
Yeah,
young, it took me a very long time. I didn't come out until my 30s and late 30s, basically. And up until then, transgender was not a word that I really knew or understood. So
Yeah.
even at that late stage for me, it was new and kind of hard to deal with. So I can't even imagine, my parents have struggled with it. Grandparents, yeah, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
It's wonderful that you had all these people around you supporting you, your parents, your aunt, like that. That's amazing. I'm so happy that that was the experience you had. Um,
Yes, and I feel very privileged. I know this is not the experience of all transgender people. I do count my blessings that I've had such an start to my transition. It really set me up for success, but it made me know that I was loved and I could pursue this without prejudice.
mhm. So jumping over to our kind of bigger, more ethereal question, now that
Sure.
you've been through it a little ways, what does transition look like for you? Or, on a deep level, what does it mean to you?
I really think it's about defying societal expectations and just forging your own identity, no matter what anyone else might say. I think um, prior to my transition, I had a very vague idea of who I was as a person, but it never really resonated with me. Being trans is kind of, it's a bit like sculpting. You have a big block of material and you're slowly chipping away at it. You know that who you are is under there, and the harder you, like, the more you work at it, the more time you spend at it, the more time you spend living your truth, the more of that material you chip away until you find the person underneath. Um, and I think at the beginning of my transition, I had ideas of who I was, in terms of like how I felt about myself and what femininity meant to me. And I think as time has gone on, I've been able to confirm that some of that is the case, but also my notion of my transness has kind of morphed a bit. I think, to be honest, my relationship with gender has got a bit more complicated because um, I've kind of sort of falling into a more recent mindset of, well, gender kind of feels like a bit of a construct at the best of times, and really transition for me is just making myself, not just accepting what I was told through my upbringing, but very much looking at all aspects of my personality and my outwards appearance and really just going for it. Just doing what I can to realize my sort of almost artistic vision, that this is how I feel about myself and this is how I want to be perceived and I want people to think about me, and just making that happen unapologetically, in some cases.
With that perspective that you've gained from your transition and from, learning those things about yourself, how do you feel that that has helped you in your personal life or your career?
I think it's really given me a deep appreciation for just how fragile and precious life can be, and how many of the things that people get worked up about in the grand scheme of things are very trivial. We're all just people who, you know, look up to our sort of authority figures at a young age and think that everyone has all of their 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 stuff together, that they know exactly what they're doing with life. And as you get older, you realize that actually everyone's winging it. Nobody really knows where their life's going to go, and that, to be honest, is part of the fun of it.
Mm-hmm.
So why not just live for yourself, live authentically, make the most of your time here. Try not to get bogged down too much in the mundane and the day to day, and really do the things that make you happy. One of those things for me is just realizing who I am. Putting on some makeup, wearing a cute dress, growing out my hair, having it dyed an outlandish color, and having that become part of who I am and how people recognize me. Because why not? It's fun and it brings a smile to the kid in the supermarket's face as they walk past him. You know, you hear them go, "Oh, their hair's so cool," because yeah, I just love bringing joy to people
Hmm.
in unexpected ways. Um, I think career-wise, it's made me really appreciate, particularly in my line of work, where quite often I'm working on websites or apps that many different people are going to consume. It's just made me realize just how many different perspectives and experiences people have. I was very fortunate in 2019, in about September, to do a talk in my local city in front of a room full of developers. And the talk was titled Web Design That Doesn't Make Trans People Uncomfortable. And the whole talk was just, if you are setting up a service where people register, allow them to change their email address. Because, hey, my dead name was in my old email address, and some companies wouldn't let me change my email address. So now I don't do business with those companies. It was things like that. Um, and it just makes you realize that, you know, if you don't work with someone who has sight issues or work with someone um, who has, you know, learning or disability needs, or, you know, struggles to read, then how do you make a product that caters to everyone, that is accessible to everyone? Um, so I think the more perspectives that you have, the better. And I try my hardest where the opportunities present themselves to be that trans voice. You know, hey guys, we're building this website where people sign up and they put in their gender. Male and female is not good enough anymore. We need a more robust set of options, because I wouldn't feel comfortable looking at that. And that's the first impression people are going to have of your service. So, yeah, just sometimes you have to be the advocate, and sometimes you have to, you know, send a few emails and be persistent about it. And occasionally people come to you for advice in the first instance, but that's, in my experience, the exception.
So, as you've gone through your journey, did you have a particular plan or anything set out, and have your goals changed as you've moved along?
Um, so initially, I was most concerned with clothing, makeup, hair. I was very much a big believer in avoiding wigs. It reminded me too much of my cross-dressing days, and it didn't feel very authentic. That's obviously just my experience. Um, but it was initially I was most concerned with socially transitioning. I wanted to be able to go out and do the things that I normally did. So I started the slow process of building up my confidence, going out in public for the first time. I remember the first time I showed up at work in a skirt, and that was big for me. That was very. It was as much about my personal comfort level as it was making a statement about who I was, and having people take that very seriously. Um, but right from the early days as well, I had one eye on medically transitioning. Um, Anyone who knows anything about trans healthcare in the UK knows that it is slow. If you go through the National Health Service, the NHS, which is, um, it is tax funded, it is free at the point of use.
Mhm.
Um, there are very long and very demeaning waiting lines to so much as have a consultation. I am still in that process 3 years later. I do not see a light at the end of the tunnel. But instead, and in my privileged position with the career that I have, I opted to go private. So you pay, but
Yeah.
you get seen pretty rapidly. And so I work with a gender specialist who is in Edinburgh. So I take a 2.5 hour drive up to Edinburgh every 3 months. Um, I receive hormone replacement therapy in the form of tablets and an injection. That has been working wonders for me. It has been really increasing my confidence, and I've been seeing the face in the mirror that I want to see. I kind of have one eye on surgeries, but to be honest, I'm not 100% sure what I want to do with that quite yet. I kind of feel like I'm a few years out from really making a decision on that.
Hmm. Are,
It's quite ironic.
are you doing the thing that some people have done, I've heard in the UK, where you go the private route for HRT and to get things started, but at the same time going through the line with the health service to in the case that in 2 years you'll be right in line and ready for that stuff?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. This is a stopgap method. So
Hmm.
right now I can get private healthcare, but as soon as the NHS catch up and they see me, I'll be able to present to them everything I've done so far, the medication I'm on, and in theory, they should be able to go, "Oh yeah, we'll cover that for you." So we'll do basically the same treatment, but rather than paying, you know, quite notable sums of money for some of the medication and the actual consultation time as well, with it being private healthcare, is also notable. It'll be virtually free, very small costs just for prescriptions. Um, but yeah, I wanted to get on with it. I needed to medically transition for my own sake.
Hmm.
Simple as that.
I,
Um,
I
but yeah, it's I was just going to say, despite my very early and quick start to proceedings, I've kind of mellowed out a bit, and so I'm not chomping at the bit to get on with surgeries. I'm still very much um, trying to figure out what I would like, if anything, and not rush into a decision there.
Do you feel, or have you heard any kind of rumblings of other people in the trans community there, that these long lines, the lack of physicians in the system, the lack of care that's available, the wait that you have to go through, do you feel that's sort of a form of institutional transphobia, or fight push back against trans people, or is it just
Um,
ineptitude?
Yes and no. I think first off, it's important to understand that the system in the UK, or in England at least, because in the different home countries there are different practices. But typically speaking, in the UK, you have gender clinics. They are in some of the major cities, and you are referred by your local doctor to one of them. I'm quite fortunate that I don't have to go very far for my closest, but I've not had an appointment with them yet, so it's a bit of a moot point. Um, and when all of that was set up, they were built at a scale that presumably was appropriate at the time, but with um, further awareness around trans issues, and more people sharing their trans stories, and sort of the advance of social media in that regard. I think just a lot more people are realizing that what they're feeling is that, and they're seeking medical help. So the amount of patients on the waiting list has skyrocketed, quite frankly. But what hasn't happened is the funding has been adjusted to match that. So we have funding levels which would have been appropriate 5 or more years ago still being applied now, when the waiting list is not manageable with that sort of capacity, bandwidth, and funding. But I definitely, so I think that's kind of like a matter of circumstance. It obviously requires a decision for something to happen, but not making a decision is a decision in itself. And I do think that the current government here in the UK are sort of willfully negligent in that sense. Um, and I've kicked the can down the road several times. Um, but I think just today, possibly, there is a High Court case being brought against the NHS by a variety of people and charities who are arguing that the waiting list is pretty much inhumane, um, and are challenging why this is being allowed, because within the NHS, there are waiting list targets that apply to all areas of the NHS, regardless of specialty. And the gender clinic is one specialist area. But it is a target which is missed in 99.9% of cases, and that is just an accepted fact. So the question is being raised: why isn't this target being applied? Why are other areas of treatment being scrutinized quite heavily when they miss their targets, but this is just an accepted norm? And I think it's hard to answer that question without talking about like institutionalized bias.
Yeah. Yeah, it gets pretty tough to defend when you've got those numbers, 90+% of the time they're missing that mark. That's just
Yeah.
terrible.
I mean, I expect my wait on the waiting list to be at least 4 years, and obviously COVID hasn't helped any because there have been periods over the last few years where the gender clinics have just shut down. We are not taking new patients right now. So what happens? Well, the waiting list doesn't go down, but people continue to, add themselves to the end of that list. It's ridiculous.
So moving back to your story specifically, what were you mentioned, the fear of initially, coming out, dressing, wearing the skirt the first time at work. What were some of the other key fears that you ran into along your transition, and how did you overcome those?
Backlash in public was definitely one of those things that, I mean, to this day, it is not a an area that I don't think about. But in the early days, when I feel like my appearance kind of betrayed how I felt about myself, I had a lot of hang-ups with just existing in public.
Mm,
I think at one point I expressed this to my girlfriend as, if you take the two options on the table, one is present masculine, the advantage of which is I feel safe in public, the disadvantage of which is I hate myself, or present the way that I want to, and the advantage is I feel happy, and the disadvantage is I get looked at weirdly. People passing on the street mutter things under their breath at me. Um, and I think calling it a fear makes it sound hypothetical because I've definitely had derogatory comments leveled at me by complete strangers. Um, but I also think that I have intentionally developed quite a thick skin to it. I think I would describe it as a sadness that you have to kind of put your blinkers on and let your peripheral vision fade away, and just kind of concentrate on the thing you're doing and just ignore the person across the street who has turned and looked at you and frowned. Um, but I used to go to work via public transport. I used to take a light rail, which is effectively subway when it arrives in the city centre. And so you're on a train. You're standing or sitting in a space with a bunch of other people who, just due to the layout, are all kind of looking at slash beyond each other and trying not to make eye contact. But there would be a week where every single part of my commute there would be someone staring for too long, and then I would look at them. They would look away. As soon as they thought I wasn't looking anymore, they would look again. And initially it was scary, but it got to the point, and I think it's at the point now where if people do that to me, I will just glare at them. I've just got fed up with it. I want them to feel as uncomfortable as I felt when I was first trying to take those brave steps outside. So that was very much one of the big challenges. I think, yeah, I've already talked about it, but the healthcare side of it, just trying to navigate all of that and know what my options are, and um, trying to make sure that things are happening in good time and I'm making good decisions was very stressful. Um, there was a degree of having my identification changed, which was actually pretty painless. But there was a lot of documentation that needed to be completed in very specific ways. And I leaned on a few people in the family who were quite good at that sort of thing to help me push through it. Um,
mm,
but yeah, I mean, I also worried about like losing friends. There are a few people that I've fallen out of touch with, but it's not because of like transphobia or unwillingness to, adjust their perception of me. It's more there were a number of people I associated with in a sort of masculine manner, where
Hmm.
it's like, oh, we are mates, we are male friends, and this is what we do. And I've just dispensed with all of that. And actually, it turns out that there wasn't really much more going on than just a bit of masculinity and bravado, and so we really don't have anything to talk about anymore.
Hmm.
But my gosh, the amount of new friends I've made has been staggering. Um, through Instagram initially. I think that's where I found my trans community. I know a few people in person now as well because I don't go to a lot of in-person events locally because I have online community. And at the top of the show, you mentioned that I am a big Dungeons and Dragons nerd, and I run two Dungeons and Dragons campaigns exclusively with people of trans experience,
Hmm.
which is amazing and gives me so much life. And it's great to have that sort of space where we can all express ourselves and not have to worry about how other people are perceiving us. It's lovely.
Yeah. That sort of ties into the next question I had, which is there anything that you feel you've been able to accomplish because of your transition?
Yeah, I mean that's a big one. I also mentioned the talk that I was able to give. That was very well received. Off the back of that talk, there were some people there from the Department for Work and Pensions, which is a government agency that does things um, um, like job tax and unemployment benefits and things like that. And they invited me to their offices in the local area, which is one of their biggest offices in the country, to give the talk again in front of a bunch of their developers. And there were a few trans members of staff in the audience for that. Um, and I got the opportunity to have some conversations after that about the challenges that they faced with legacy systems, where, for example, a gender marker is required and it is male or female, and they wanted to move away from that. Or one component of my talk as well was um, Mr., Mrs., Ms., that sort of thing is also a bit problematic, particularly with non-binary people who may often choose something else. So if you give them a limited option, it's not very inclusive. Um, and they're making considerations like old people like that, and they find it to be more official. So it's not always an easy conversation to get government to change their ways, but I was very proud and honoured to have the opportunity to feed into that, even if it was just a little.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then D&D. It's just been fantastic. I think I've really found my voice and my creativity sort of in my transition through that. Um, it's really helped me come to terms with I actually don't really care about having a deep voice, and I kind of own that when playing D&D. I put on the accents, I modulate my voice a little bit. I really try not to get hung up on not having the perfect feminine voice.
Hmm.
Um, and it's really made me think twice about whether I even want to do voice coach, like voice training, um, because it's a part of me that I'm actually not too bothered about.
Hmm. Well, that's good. Yeah, that you find that sense of self and find that confidence in your identity that, this is me and this is how I'm going to present as me and I am good enough. It's sort of that
Yeah,
wonderful place to get to in your journey, as opposed to where you start, where you need all this outside validation and you need this like
yeah,
assurance that you're okay, and you set all these goals for yourself. And that's why I had that question in there as well, that you put all these things in front of you that like you have to do and you have to tick all these boxes, and essentially you fall right into that same pattern of like, now that if you're a binary trans person, I've changed to this gender and now I have to fall into all of these stereotypes.
yeah.
It's a really easy trap to fall into, and it's great when you get to that point of like, no, these are the things I want to be, and I'm
Mm.
happy with myself.
Yeah, it's very much rooted in external validation of myself. I want to look a certain way because I want people to think of me a certain way. And I think if I were to go back in time 3 years and speak to myself, on the precipice of that transition, making plans for what to do, and I was to say, look, I've not done voice training. I don't know if I'm going to have surgery, um, and things like that. I think they would be like, wait, did you give up? But no, I've just decided, I've just had time to think, and I've decided that these are the things that are really important to me, and these things aren't. Um, but you have to go through the process to really understand yourself and understand uh, what makes you who you are.
Mhm. What is your favorite thing that you've learned through your journey, either about yourself or the world?
I think about the world, there is a lot of compassion and love, and I think the thing that I hadn't really realized prior to having a sense of trans community is just how much love there can be for people you've never met, for people that you don't know. Um, and you can express on social media that you're having a bad day, and someone who's never spoken to you before will just pop in with a heart, or they'll send you a short message saying, thinking about you today. Just that little checkup. And it's been absolutely wonderful. I think the kindness of people can be limitless, and I try to live through those values that other people have um, demonstrated to me, and just stop where I can and just be encouraging of people, and try and show people love where I can. Um, and then about myself, I think um, I to be honest, pre-transition, I was a pretty miserable, boring person, and I think I've realized just how much color there is in my life. And I don't just mean my hair. I think I am the sort of person who likes to just make people laugh. If that means being goofy, or in D&D, just cracking a good joke or putting on a silly accent or something like that. Um, it just yeah, it brings me no end of satisfaction to see people come away from an interaction with me with a smile. um so yeah, I just didn't realize I had a capacity for that.
What advice do you have for younger closeted trans folks out there?
One thing that is very easy to get away from, particularly early in transition or when you're on the edge of like looking into that journey, is yes, there are potentially a lot of steps to it, but it is a one step at a time journey. Um, you go at your own pace. You go in the order that you wish. But I think the metaphor that worked for me in my transition was transitioning is a bit like building a brick wall. You can't build the top of the brick wall without building the bottom, and you build it one brick at a time. You take as long as you want laying each brick. The wall will wait for you. Um, But when you start laying bricks, you realize that you can lay more bricks. For me, it was little things. It was going outside presenting for the first time. It was telling people my truth. And I think you don't have to worry too much about, oh gosh, what's this going to be like in a year's time? What's the rest of my life going to look like? Do it for you. Do it on your own terms. Um, Start small. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. It's okay to fail. Um, if you try to do something and it doesn't work out, think on why that is. Don't give up. Um, and if now is not your time, then tomorrow is always coming.